My sister-in-law called from Edinburgh and said the greatest shame of her life was watching my husband marry me. It was the 12th time she'd said something like that. This time I didn't argue. I shut off the platinum card I'd been funding for her overseas life, down to the last cent. 5 days later, my mother-in-law got a call from Scotland. The man on the line asked one question, and my husband's whole family went silent. "Are you the legal guarantor for Miss Madeline Hart?" The phone rang while I was reviewing a revised finish package for a boutique hotel restoration in Charleston. My office was sealed in that late afternoon stillness that only happens in expensive buildings, where even the silence feels managed. The climate system hummed above me. Sunlight spilled in a long golden slab across the edge of my desk. On one side were stone samples, metal finishes, and fabric swatches laid out in neat order. On the other was a spreadsheet with 3 tabs open, each one representing a different version of the same problem. Money had a way of showing you what people valued most. So did interruption. I looked at the flashing overseas number on my screen and knew before I answered that whatever came through the speaker would not be affection, gratitude, or even simple decency. Madeline never called to ask how I was. She never called because she missed her brother. She called when she wanted to take. Sometimes money, sometimes energy, sometimes dignity. She had never seemed to care which one cost me more. I let the call ring 6 times before I picked up. "Hello, Nora." Her voice came through rich with amusement, music pulsing behind it. I heard laughter, glass against glass, a man's voice too close to the phone, then distance again as she moved somewhere quieter. "Madeline," I said. "What is it?" "God," she said with a laugh. "Must you always sound like a woman about to reject a contractor's invoice? Relax. I just need something." "Of course you do." She made a small offended sound. "That tone is exactly what I mean. Honestly, you've become so unpleasant. Anyway, I need a transfer. Not huge. There are some additional studio costs this term, and my landlord has suddenly become impossible about timing. Also, one of the girls here is selling a vintage Kelly bag, and if I don't get it now, I'll never find one in this color again. It's practically an investment." I sat back in my chair. "How much?" "You're so dramatic." "Around 8,000 should settle everything for now." "For now." Another pause. Then the familiar shift in her tone, the turn from entitled to cruel. That was always Madeline's real talent. She never asked without punishing you for hesitating. "You know," she said, "it's funny. Money really does change people. My brother used to say you were driven. I didn't realize that meant you'd become this cold, this stingy, this grasping." I said nothing. Silence was gasoline to her. "Do you even remember what your life looked like before Ethan?" She let out a little breath through her nose. "The greatest humiliation of my life was watching him marry you. Truly. If I'd known he'd end up with someone who counted every penny and acted like being useful made her equal to the rest of us, I would have dragged him out of that church myself." My fingers tightened around the pen in my hand. 12th time. That number passed through me like something solid. Not the first time she'd called me a mistake. Not the first time she'd implied I had married up. Not the first time she'd treated my money as a family utility and my personhood as an inconvenience. The 12th. A number large enough to expose a pattern and small enough to tell you exactly how long you had betrayed yourself by letting it continue. The first few times I'd convinced myself it wasn't worth a war. Then I had told myself she was immature. Then I had told myself Ethan was already stretched thin and didn't need more conflict at home. Then, worst of all, I had told myself that being the bigger person meant tolerating behavior that would have been intolerable from anyone else. But there comes a moment in every long humiliation when it stops hurting like a fresh wound and starts feeling like evidence. That moment had arrived. "Well," she said when I didn't answer. "Are you sending it or not?" I put the pen down very carefully. "Madeline," I said, "your card is being turned off today." The music in the background seemed to disappear. "What?" "Every transfer. Every recurring charge. Every autopay under my authorization ends today. Tuition that has already been paid is paid. The rest is no longer my concern." For 1 second there was silence so complete I could hear her breathing. Then she exploded. "You insane little. Do not threaten me," I said. "Do not scream at me. And do not make the mistake of thinking the money you've been burning through for the past 3 years belonged to your family. It was mine. I earned it. I approved it. I am ending it. You can't do this. She shouted. Ethan will never let you do this. My mother will destroy you. You think you matter because you have an office and a title. You're still the outsider, Nora. You always will be. No, Madeline, I said. That's exactly what you still don't understand. One of us has been funding the fantasy, and it wasn't your family. Then I ended the call. For a moment I stayed very still, my thumb still resting against the red button on the screen. Then I exhaled. It wasn't peace I felt. Not yet. Peace would have implied softness. This was cleaner and harder than that. It felt like cutting away something infected. There was pain in it, and there was relief. But above all there was clarity. I pressed the intercom. Lena, can you come in for a minute? My operations controller stepped in 2 minutes later with a tablet under one arm, and a look that suggested she had already guessed this was not about tile margins. Everything okay? I turned my screen toward her. Freeze the Platinum supplementary card ending in 1148. Remove all recurring transfers linked to Edinburgh. Flag any request associated with Madeline Hart for direct review by me. Nothing moves unless it has my approval in writing. Lena's brows lifted very slightly. That was all. She had good instincts and better discretion. Understood. And Lena? Yes. If my husband, my mother-in-law, or anyone from Heartline calls finance to reverse it, the answer is no unless it comes from me. Not verbal. Not casual. Not family-level urgent. Something flickered in her eyes then. Not curiosity exactly. Recognition. She had watched enough of my life from the edges to know that when a woman like me started putting things in writing, the decision had already been made far below the level of mood. I'll take care of it, she said. When she left, I rose and walked to the window. Boston stretched below me in steel, glass, and late light. Traffic moved in disciplined lines. Delivery trucks stopped, unloaded, moved on. Pedestrians crossed only when the signal changed. The city was full of systems, timelines, boundaries, terms. At home, the Hart family operated on something else entirely. Emotion, delay, assumption, and the quiet expectation that if things became expensive enough, I would eventually absorb the difference. I stood there long enough to realize something unsettling. I had not simply been generous. I had been infrastructure. And nothing angers people more than discovering the bridge beneath them has decided it is no longer public property. The next 48 hours were unnaturally quiet. Ethan texted me on the first evening to say he had dinner with lenders. On the second, he said a side issue had kept him late. He did not mention Madeline. He did not ask me whether the card had really been shut down. He did not tell me his mother had been calling him in tears. That told me more than any confrontation would have. He knew. And like many men raised inside a system that had always bent around them, he was hoping reality might soften if he delayed looking directly at it. His mother didn't come the first day either. Or the second. That was what made me certain she would come on the third. The doorbell started hammering through the house just after 3 in the afternoon. I was in the sitting room sorting through material boards from a recent client presentation. The ringing was hard, repetitive, impatient. Not the sound of someone arriving. The sound of someone demanding admission. I walked to the door and checked the inset glass. Diane Hart stood there in a cream coat and pearl earrings, one hand gripping her handbag so tightly her knuckles had blanched. Her face was set in the expression she wore whenever she believed morality and irritation had formed an alliance in her favor. I opened the door. She pushed past me before I could say anything. So it's true, she snapped. You actually did it. I closed the door behind her, slid the lock into place and turned. If you're going to shout, at least sit down first. Sit down? She spun on me in the foyer. My daughter is on the other side of the world with a declined card and a landlord threatening penalties, and you want me to sit down? I walked into the living room and sat anyway. Smoothed my skirt over my knees. Looked up at her. Your daughter is 24. She jabbed a finger at me. On what authority did you do this? That is family money. My son's money. You had no right to humiliate her. No right, I repeated. That's an interesting phrase. Her mouth tightened. Don't get clever with me. Madeline is studying abroad. She needs support. She needs proper housing, proper social access, proper presentation. You think those things don't matter. Maybe where you came from they didn't. But our family has standards. There it was. The old poison. Never enough to sound vulgar to an outsider. Just enough to make sure I heard what was really being said. I leaned forward, opened the drawer in the coffee table, and took out a thick black ledger. It landed on the glass with a flat, heavy sound. Diane faltered for half a second. Since we're discussing rights, I said, let's discuss numbers. Let's stop saying family and support and standards as though they aren't just prettier clothes for invoices. Here is what your daughter has cost me in the last 3 years. I opened the ledger and turned it toward her. Each page was dated, itemized, cross-referenced. I had not begun keeping records because I planned for war. I had done it because some quiet part of me knew that when kindness becomes routine, people start pretending it never had a source. October. I pointed to the page. £900 for a private club renewal she said was necessary for networking. $460 for floral arrangements for a dinner she claimed was academically relevant. $1,100 for a ski deposit because she was under unbearable school pressure. $2,200 for a resale handbag because all the girls in her circle carried investment pieces, and she couldn't be the only one who looked provincial. Diane's lips parted, then closed again. I flipped forward. December. $5,000 for a so-called winter residency that turned out to be a New Year's stay in St. Moritz. January. Duplicate transfers for apartment issues. Except the apartment invoices were routed through a concierge service attached to luxury rental management. March. Emergency cash for course supplies that somehow coincided with a table reservation at a private member's dining room. Diane folded her arms. This is petty. No, this is specific. She's young, she snapped. Young people overspend. Young women want to fit in. That doesn't mean you cut them off like a loan shark. It means, I said, that someone should have taught her years ago that wanting something is not the same as having a claim to it. Diane stared at me. You have always resented her. I let out one quiet breath. I have resented being treated like a resource by someone who speaks to me with contempt. That's not the same thing. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I kept going. Do you know what regular rescue does to a person, Diane? It doesn't make them feel loved. Not after a while. It makes them feel entitled. It trains them to experience support as atmosphere. They stop seeing the hand. They only notice the air when it changes. Her jaw tightened. She's your sister-in-law. No, I said. She's my husband's sister. And for 3 years, every time she wanted something she had not earned, your family quietly agreed that my ability to provide it made it my responsibility to provide it. That is not the same thing. Diane moved closer, her voice dropping into something sharper. You think this house, this life, your social standing happened in a vacuum. You married into a family with a name. I met her gaze. And your family married into a woman with liquidity, judgment, and a much higher tolerance for chaos than she should have had. That hit. I could see it. Not because the sentence was cruel, but because it was true enough to strip away ceremony. I closed the ledger. Madeline's allowance is over. If you or Ethan wish to support her, you're free to do so from your own accounts. But from me, from my company, from my lines of credit, from my labor, not another cent moves without structure. Diane looked as though she had bitten into metal. You really think you run this family now? No, I said. I think I've stopped pretending I don't hold together more of it than any of you were willing to admit. She left 20 minutes later with all the fury of a woman who had meant to dominate a conversation, and instead discovered she had arrived years too late. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass. The house went still again. That evening, the stillness lasted until almost 11:30. I was in the study reviewing a lighting mock-up when I heard the front door open, then close, then the familiar sound of Ethan dropping his keys into the bowl in the entryway. He lingered downstairs for several minutes, long enough to pour himself a drink, maybe long enough to rehearse. Then he came up. He stood in the doorway of my study, tie loosened, coat unbuttoned, weariness all over him like a second layer of skin. He smelled faintly of whiskey and cold air. Mom came by, he said. I saved the document on my screen and shut the laptop. I assumed she would. He stepped in and closed the door behind him. Nora. What's going on with you and Madeline? My mother is beside herself. Madeline says her rent payment failed. Her card was declined in front of people. She says you shut off everything in the middle of the term. Why don't you first ask what she said to me before you ask what I did? He rubbed at his forehead. I know she can be rude. Rude. He let out a breath. Fine. Cruel. Immature. Thoughtless. Pick one. But she's under pressure. Different country. Different environment. She's probably in over her head and lashing out. That doesn't mean you go nuclear. I stood and came around the desk. Let's say she is in over her head. Why is your assumption still that I should be the one kneeling down to carry her out? Because you've been helping, he said, as if the sentence explained itself. Exactly. The word hung between us. I have been helping, Ethan. For years. That is not the same as agreeing to help forever under any condition. And it's certainly not the same as agreeing to be insulted while I do it. He sat in the chair opposite my desk and leaned forward, hands clasped. Okay. She crossed a line. More than one. I get that. But did you have to handle it like this? Could you not have called me first? We could have adjusted things, set limits, talked to her, worked something out without humiliating her. I looked at him for a long moment. Humiliating her, I said softly. That's what stands out to you. His expression shifted. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Because what's humiliating to Madeline is not debt, or dependency, or needing money she didn't earn. It's having that dependency made visible. That's what everyone is upset about. Not the structure. The exposure. He fell quiet. A year ago I would have softened then. I would have taken his silence as conflict, and conflict as something to be carefully soothed if a marriage was to survive. But by then I had learned something uglier. In some homes, peace isn't harmony. It's just the name given to one person's ongoing surrender. You always ask me to be patient, I said. To be the bigger person. To let things go for the sake of your family. But have you ever noticed how that bargain works? The bigger person gives. The rest of you stay comfortable. And somehow that arrangement gets called love. He looked up at me, tiredness and frustration pulling at his face. So what do you want from me? I want you to understand that the old arrangement is over. He said nothing. I folded my arms. I will not fund Madeline's lifestyle anymore. Not informally. Not quietly. Not because your mother cries. Not because she says I'm an outsider. Not because you've had a hard quarter. If you want to continue supporting her, then we formalize everything. Asset boundaries. Exposure lines. Clear separation between Heartline's liabilities and Vale and North's. No more blurring my resources into your family emergency fund. He stared at me. You're talking like a lawyer. No. I'm talking like a woman who has finally realized everyone around her only respects a boundary when it arrives in a language they can't sentimentalize away. A pulse flickered in his jaw. You would really go that far? I thought of every dinner where I had smiled through Diane's condescension. Every transfer I had approved because Ethan looked worn out and said, just this once. Every call from Madeline layered with disdain and demand. Yes, I said. I would. He stood abruptly, then stopped himself from pacing. Do you hear how this sounds? It sounds like you're threatening to tear apart our marriage over my sister. No. I said it plainly. I am refusing to let your marriage continue functioning as an insurance policy for your family's irresponsibility. He looked at me then not as a husband looks at a wife in an argument, but as a man looks at a structure he had leaned on for so long he forgot it could crack. You don't have to answer tonight, I said. But hear me clearly. The era of informal rescue is over. I left him standing there and went to the bedroom. That night, for the first time in months, I slept all the way through without waking in the dark with my jaw clenched. 5 days later, Diane came back. Only this time she did not ring like an invader. She pressed the bell once. Waited. Pressed again. When I checked the camera, she was standing motionless on the front step with her phone held in both hands and a look on her face I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear strips people. It takes away the armor of role and vanity and family mythology. It leaves only scale. In that moment Diane looked not like the matriarch of a proud household, but like a mother who had suddenly discovered she knew almost nothing about the child she had spent years overprotecting. I opened the door. She stepped inside without speaking. Can we sit down? She asked quietly. I led her to the living room. She sat on the very edge of the sofa, posture stiff, shoulders high. I brought her water. She picked up the glass, then put it down untouched. What happened? She looked at me and swallowed. I got a call. From Scotland. I stayed silent. It wasn't Madeline, she said. It was a man. He asked if I was her mother. I said yes, and then he asked whether I was the legal guarantor for Madeline Hart, or whether there was another immediate family member responsible for her contracts and liabilities. The room went very still. Did he identify himself? Not properly. He said he was calling in connection with a matter that required urgent family response. He asked for Ethan's number, or her father's if her father was still alive. I asked what this was about, whether Madeline was in trouble, whether he was from the school, the police, a law office. He said details would only be discussed once liability was confirmed. And then, Diane's fingers tightened around the phone. Then he said this matter should not be ignored any longer. I leaned back slowly. Did you give him anything? No. I panicked and hung up. Then I tried to call back, but it wouldn't connect. Nora. What does this mean? Has she done something? Is someone threatening her? Is this because you cut off the money? There was accusation in that last question, but it was weak, almost reflexive. I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. This does not sound like a university matter, I said. It sounds like Madeline may have attached her name to something that has now become expensive enough for other people to start looking for whoever stands behind her. Diane went white. No. Did she ever mention a boyfriend? An investor? A business idea? A social circle that suddenly mattered more than school? Diane shook her head helplessly. She said she had friends, events, people with connections. She said everyone networked. She said if she wanted to build a real career, she couldn't behave like a poor student. I looked away for a moment. Of course. Diane leaned toward me. You know something, don't you? Tell me if you know something. I do not know enough yet, I said. But listen to me carefully. Do not call her and warn her. Do not send money. Do not answer any unfamiliar overseas number unless I tell you to. Panic is the fastest way to make a situation like this more dangerous. She stared at me. What do we do then? I stood. I find out the truth. Once Diane left, I went straight to the study, locked the door, and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a spare phone, rarely used and never left in obvious places. There were only a handful of numbers in it. One belonged to Isla Mercer in Edinburgh. 5 years earlier, we had worked on opposite sides of a hospitality fraud issue that had nearly destroyed a client's expansion plan. Isla had the kind of competence you cannot buy from firms with polished websites. She knew how to separate gossip from pattern, panic from leverage, legal theater from actual risk. She answered on the third ring. Isla Mercer. Isla. Nora Bennett. A short pause, then recognition. That is not a social call. No. I need eyes on someone in Edinburgh. Quickly. Full picture. Academic status. Real residence. Binding. Known associates. Any private lenders, civil exposure guarantee forms, social patterns, and who has begun contacting family. Her voice sharpened. Name. I gave it to her. Full legal name, date of birth, program details, address history, known numbers, passport scan, social profiles, the fragments Diane had repeated. When I finished, Isla was quiet. This sounds unpleasant, she said. It is. How fast do you need a preliminary read? As fast as possible. You'll have something in 72 hours. Good. Nora. Yes. If someone has moved from pressuring the girl to contacting family, the matter is already in escalation mode. I looked out into the dark garden beyond the windows. I know. The next 3 days moved with the outer shape of normal life and the inner pulse of waiting. At the office, I chaired vendor calls, approved 2 revised budgets, and sat through a presentation by a hotel ownership group that wanted something timeless but disruptive, as if contradiction were a design style instead of a symptom of people too wealthy to speak plainly. I answered emails, reviewed elevations, walked a site in Beacon Hill, smiled where required, chose stone, corrected people, signed off on lighting temperatures. At home, Ethan watched me carefully without asking the real question. He could tell something had happened after Diane's visit. He just didn't know what. On the second night, he hovered in the kitchen while I poured tea. Did my mother tell you why she came by? Yes. And what? He looked tired enough to age in front of me. Nora. I set the kettle down. When I know enough to speak usefully, I will. Until then, worry in silence or don't. But do not ask me to comfort you through uncertainty that exists because your family spent years preferring not to know. That hit harder than I intended. Or perhaps exactly as hard as I intended. He looked down and left the kitchen without another word. On the third evening, the report arrived. Encrypted file. Secure link. One-line message from Isla. Preliminary. Open alone. I took the laptop into the study, locked the door and opened the file. The first page made my body go still. Madeline's attendance was dismal. Formal academic warnings. Missed deliverables. Faculty concerns. One more bad term and she would likely have been removed from the program she had used for years as a moral shield for every indulgence. The apartment she had described as necessary, central, and not at all extravagant turned out to be a serviced luxury flat in Newtown managed through a concierge-linked portfolio. Panoramic windows. Security. Private cleaning. Monthly costs that would have embarrassed a junior executive, let alone a student. The spending analysis was worse. Private clubs. Dining rooms. Exclusive events. Designer resale. Luxury transport. Cash advances. Transfers labeled as temporary placements. Circulation holds. Investment trust. Access collateral. Most of those terms meant nothing in respectable finance and everything in the economies of performance and coercion that grow around people eager to look rich before they are stable. Then I found the recurring name. Callum Reeve. Isla's note on him was brief, but it was enough. Lifestyle broker. Access consultant. Luxury circulation intermediary. Prior civil complaints. Connected to gray market resellers, short-term private lenders, and a former associate questioned in relation to aggressive debt recovery. Clean enough on paper to get invited into rooms. Dirty enough beneath it to make those rooms dangerous. The next pages mapped the pattern. Madeline had been sending him money, receiving things through him, attending events organized around his network. More disturbingly, she had signed 2 temporary personal guarantees tied to short-term inventory movements and event-side financing, likely dressed up as a way to prove seriousness, signal trust, or secure status in a circle that traded on bluff and proximity. One deal had collapsed. One lender had not been repaid. And because Callum was already repositioning himself, the easiest pressure point left was the rich American girl whose family seemed likely to panic and pay. I sat back in the chair and read the pages again. Madeline had not simply become extravagant. She had become legible to predators. There were photos too. Madeline outside private clubs in Kashmir and borrowed confidence. Madeline on the edge of a yacht that did not belong to anyone her age. Madeline laughing at a dinner table where every object on the surface seemed designed to reassure insecure people they were among the powerful. In several of those photos always nearby was Callum Reeve. Mid-30s. Fine coat. Relaxed posture. The cultivated ease of a man who knew exactly how to make foolish people feel chosen while quietly converting them into risk. I was on the second pass through the file when there was a knock. Ethan. I closed the screen halfway, then opened it again. Come in. He stepped into the study and stopped when he saw my face. What happened? I turned the laptop toward him. Sit down. He did. For several minutes he read without speaking. I watched the color leave his face in stages. First at the academic warnings, then at the apartment, then the spending, then Callum, then the guarantees. No, he said under his breath. No. Yes. He looked up at me, stunned. How real is this? Real enough that family contact has started. Real enough that pretending it's just a rough patch would be suicidal. He pushed his chair back and stood up, then sat down again, as if his body couldn't decide what posture matched the level of damage. What does she owe? I slid him the summary table. That is the current verified exposure. There are likely inflated threats around it. Also likely more embarrassment than substance in some corners. But enough of it is real to matter. He stared at the number and swore. I gave her everything, he said quietly. Every excuse. Every benefit of the doubt. Every time you said she was spiraling, I told myself she was young and dramatic, not lost. I said nothing. He looked at me then with a kind of wrecked honesty I hadn't seen from him in a long time. I used you, didn't I? The bluntness of it surprised me. I considered lying. Or softening it. Old habits. Instead I said you leaned on me. Repeatedly. And every time I absorbed the cost, it taught all of you the wrong lesson. His eyes closed. What do we do? That question changed something. Not because it gave me power. I already had that. But because it admitted it. You and your mother come to my office tomorrow at 9, I said. No drama. No bargaining. I will explain the structure of the problem, and the structure of any help I am willing to provide. If you want me involved, you accept terms. Terms, he repeated. Yes. He rubbed his face hard with both hands. She's my sister. And I am your wife. Yet somehow your sister has had freer access to my money, my patience, and the benefit of your instinctive protection than I have had to your clear judgment. That ends now. He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he just nodded once, very slowly. The conference room at Vale and North had one glass wall, one oak table, and enough space to make truth feel echoing. I chose it for that reason. At 8:55, Diane arrived in a tailored navy coat and the expression of a woman trying not to unravel in public. Ethan came 2 minutes later. My assistant brought coffee, then left. I closed the door. 3 packets sat on the table, one in front of each chair. I did not begin until they had both sat down. What you're about to read is a summary, I said. Not the full report. Enough for action. Not enough for argument. Diane looked at the packet but didn't touch it. Ethan opened his immediately. After a second, Diane did too. The room stayed silent for several minutes except for the sound of paper. Then Diane made a small broken noise in the back of her throat. No. No one answered. She turned another page and began to cry. This can't be right. She said she was building a network. She said these events mattered. She said the apartment was temporary and cheaper than it looked because of a student arrangement. People like Callum survive by making expensive lies sound like insider knowledge, I said. That's part of the business model. Diane looked up sharply. What business model? Appearance. Aspiration. Excess. They flatter the vanity of people who want to skip the slow part of adulthood. Then they use that vanity as collateral. Her face crumpled. You make it sound like she wanted this. She wanted the life attached to it, I said. That is not the same thing as wanting the danger. But it is exactly what made the danger effective. Ethan spoke next, voice rough. How exposed are we? Really? We are not yet at criminal catastrophe, I said. We are at financial coercion with the potential to worsen if handled badly. Some claims are likely inflated. Some are real. Some are designed to scare the family into fast private payment. Which means panic is what the other side wants. Diane covered her mouth. Oh God. I let that sit. Then I continued. Here is the part neither of you gets to avoid. This did not happen in a vacuum. Madeline did not wake up one morning and become vulnerable to this by chance. She was trained into it. Trained to believe money appears when she needs it. Trained to believe presentation outranks substance. Trained to believe family will always step between her and consequences. Diane looked at me through tears. She's my daughter. Yes. Which is why you should have taught her years ago that rescue without limits does not feel like love forever. Eventually it feels like permission. Ethan stared at the papers in front of him. Can you fix it? He asked. I can help manage it, I said. I can coordinate strategy, contain exposure, work with counsel. But I will not fix it inside the old structure. I slid a second document toward them. My conditions. Diane's face hardened slightly reflexively. Even frightened people look for familiar power if they've practiced it long enough. This is not the time for leverage, Nora. No, I said. This is the precise time for leverage. Leverage is what keeps a crisis from becoming a habit. I watched them read. No informal transfers to Madeline. No personal cards. No emergency cash routed through friends, relatives, or Heartline accounts. Any funds used in the Scotland matter would be documented as recoverable obligations, not gifts. Madeline would return to the U.S. when counsel cleared travel and enter a formal restriction framework. Supervise spending, employment, counseling, and repayment. No member of the Hart family would sign for her, co-sign for her, or verbally assure anyone of support again. Heartline Development would open relevant short-term liquidity and debt data for independent review if I was expected to help prevent spillover from this crisis into other obligations. And Ethan and I would formalize a clear boundary between our companies, our assets, and any future family liabilities. Diane stared at the pages as if they were personally offensive. This is monstrous. No. I said it very calmly. This is what adulthood looks like when no one can afford theater anymore. She turned to Ethan. Say something. He kept reading. I saw the moment the practical side of him realized there was no path through this that did not pass directly through my terms. Not because I enjoyed control, but because I was the only one at the table who knew how to build any structure stronger than guilt. Mom, he said at last, stop. We are not negotiating with reality. Then he signed. Diane looked at him as if he had betrayed her. Slowly, with tears still on her face, she signed too. 48 hours later, Ethan and I were on a flight to Edinburgh. He called it helping. I privately called it retrieval. The city met us in cold gray light and air sharp enough to wake every nerve. Old stone. Narrow streets. Black railings. Elegant facades holding centuries of other people's grief, ambition, and foolishness. Edinburgh had the kind of beauty that makes human vanity look very small if you know how to look at it. Isla Mercer met us in a private office above a solicitor's suite in the Newtown district. She was dressed in dark wool, hair pinned back, expression economical. Mr. Hart, she said to Ethan after introductions. Your sister is not under criminal detention. That much is good. But she is under pressure. Mr. Reeve and the men around him prefer pressure that remains technically civil until it no longer needs to. Ethan frowned. Meaning they trade on fear, embarrassment, and the assumption that families like yours prefer private payment to public attention. He sat down hard in the chair opposite her. Can we see Madeline? Yes. Briefly. But understand that she still does not fully grasp the seriousness of her position. That is common when people have spent a long time treating humiliation as the worst possible outcome. It leaves them blind to other forms of danger. The consultation room where we met Madeline was elegantly neutral. Soft light. Oak table. 2 low chairs. No bars. No uniforms. Nothing cinematic enough to match the catastrophe she had imagined, and yet somehow still not imagined clearly enough. She was already seated when we entered. She looked expensive from a distance. Up close the seams showed. Her hair was too carefully styled. Her makeup too precise. The eyes beneath it were ringed with sleeplessness and something that had finally begun to resemble fear. When she saw us, relief flashed across her face so quickly it almost hurt to look at. Ethan. Nora. Thank God. This has gotten ridiculous. I just need you to settle this so I can get out of here and sort things out privately. There it was. Still no apology. Still no truth. Straight to extraction. I remained standing. Start with the part you haven't told anyone. Her expression hardened. I don't know what you've been hearing, but Callum is not some criminal mastermind. He had investors. Things got tangled. People are using me to get at him because they know I have family. Family. Always that word. I sat down at last and placed the summary file on the table. How much did you sign for, Madeline? She looked away. I don't know exactly. How much? She crossed her arms. It wasn't supposed to become real. That is not a number. 40. Maybe 60. I don't know. It depended on circulation timing and who closed which placement. It wasn't like a normal debt. It was bridge leverage. Temporary. I could almost hear Isla's internal reaction from across the room. Bridge leverage, I repeated. Temporary. Do you hear yourself? Madeline's chin lifted. You don't understand how things work here. No, I said. You don't understand how predators work anywhere. Her eyes flashed. Oh, so now I'm stupid. No. You were vain enough to think risk would arrive dressed badly. That landed. Ethan flinched. Madeline stared at me. Then she looked away. Ethan spoke, voice cracking. Why didn't you call me? She laughed once, bitter and thin. Because you'd tell Mom and Mom would panic and then Nora would act like this and turn it into a courtroom. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out. With what money, Madeline? Your own. She didn't answer. I opened the file. Here is the verified estimate. Here is what counsel believes can be negotiated downward. Here is what appears to be intimidation theater. And here is what happens if you keep treating this like a misunderstanding instead of a collapse. Her eyes moved down the numbers. I watched the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. No. That's what paper does once somebody stops protecting you from reading it. Her mouth trembled. Callum said if anything got messy, he'd handle it. Of course he did. There was no softness left in me for that line. Too many women had been destroyed by believing that charm and rescue travel in the same suit. You have two paths, I said. 1. Keep protecting his version of events and let the damage widen. 2. Cooperate fully. Cut contact. Sign a return and compliance structure. Work. Repay. Learn what money is when it has a cost attached to it. She stared at me. You want me under house arrest? No. I want you in reality. The negotiations over the next 2 days were long, technical, and ugly in a way that makes television seem childish. There were no dramatic confessions. No handcuffs. No surprise raids. Just documents. Calls. Reviews of what was enforceable versus performative. Quiet conversations with people who had made careers out of knowing how much fear translated into payment. I stayed in every room. Not because I wanted to. Because I was the only one in the heart orbit who understood that mercy without structure would only recreate the same disaster in another city 6 months later. At one point during a break, Ethan stood beside me near the window of Isla's office, looking down at the slate roofs and wet stone streets below. I don't know how you do this, he said. Do what? Stay this calm. I looked at him. I am not calm. I am disciplined. Those are different things. Calm is a feeling. Discipline is a choice. He absorbed that in silence. After a moment he said, I really did think I was keeping the peace all these years. No. You were outsourcing the cost of it. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. That was the strange thing about crisis. Sometimes it did what years of marriage could not. It forced language to become exact. Madeline, meanwhile, lurched between denial and panic. In one meeting she insisted the whole thing was blown out of proportion. In the next she wept and said she had never meant for any of it to happen. At lunch on the second day, she turned to me with reddened eyes and said the sentence I had expected from the moment we landed. Can't you just pay the verified amount and let me figure the rest out later? I looked at her across the small table. Later is the favorite word of people who do not intend to change. She stared back. You have the money. And you have the debt. Her face twisted. You really hate me. That, more than anything else she'd said, exhausted me. No, Madeline. If I hated you, I would leave you in the version of yourself that thinks every closed door is cruelty and every boundary is abuse. What I am refusing to do is help you stay stupid. She looked like I had struck her. Good, I thought. Some truth should land hard. By the final afternoon, a structure had been negotiated. Not easy, not pretty, but survivable. Certain claims were reduced under pressure of scrutiny. Others were exposed as inflated and quietly pulled back. One particularly aggressive private lender chose paperwork over publicity. Once it became clear we were not a panicked family with no counsel. The most dangerous piece was not the size of the debt itself. It was how easily Madeline had become useful to a network that fed on aspiration and shame. She signed the return documents with a hand that shook visibly. No luxury apartment. No unrestricted funds. No private cards. Mandatory employment. Supervised accounts. Counseling. Repayment tracking. No contact with Callum or anyone connected to his network. When it was done, she sat there staring at the page as if the ink itself had altered the shape of her life. Then she looked up at me with something I had never seen in her before. Not love. Not gratitude. Recognition. That I was the first wall she had hit that didn't move. We returned to Boston 3 days later. Diane wanted silence. Of course she did. She wanted the matter folded away as a misunderstanding abroad, a frightening chapter better forgotten, a family embarrassment, not a structural indictment. I refused. Not publicly. I had no interest in spectacle. But privately, administratively, financially, I refused to let the old looseness grow back over new damage. Within 10 days, the framework was in place. Madeline moved into a smaller supervised apartment tied to a transitional support arrangement I trusted. She began part-time work in customer support for a high-end furnishings reseller, which I did not choose for poetic justice, though I noticed it. Heartline opened its short-term liquidity position for review. Ethan replaced a controller who had become too comfortable with internal vagueness. Diane was instructed in writing that any transfer to Madeline outside approved channels would result in immediate withdrawal of my involvement in all related matters. The first time Diane protested, she did it in the breakfast room with all the weary indignation of a woman who believed motherhood should exempt her from process. "This is degrading," she said. "For her. For me." I set down my coffee. "No. What's degrading is expecting other people to turn your love into unrestricted payment, because saying no would make you feel cruel." Her eyes flashed. "She's my daughter. And being her mother does not mean you get to outsource the bill for that to everyone else." She did not speak to me for 2 days after that. The silence was one of the more restful gifts she had ever given me. Months passed. Life did not become warm. It became orderly. That mattered more. Vale and North expanded into 2 new hospitality accounts. My margins improved. My evenings stopped being vulnerable to international emergencies disguised as family duty. Ethan changed in ways that were real if not dramatic. He asked before assuming. He explained rather than expected. He looked tired less often, perhaps because he had finally stopped asking me to carry the emotional labor of protecting his family from itself while smiling through it. Diane softened at the edges, but I did not mistake compliance for transformation. Fear of consequence often produces manners. That is not the same thing as wisdom. And Madeline. The first real sign of change came in the form of an email sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. "Nora." I opened it and read slowly. She wrote about a customer who had yelled at her over a delayed delivery, and how for the first time in her life she had understood what it felt like to be treated as a function instead of a person. She wrote that she had spent years assuming money simply appeared around competent people the way light appeared when a switch was flipped. She wrote that in her first month of tracking her own spending, she had been embarrassed by how many things she used to call necessities that were really just panic purchases for social approval. Then near the end she wrote the line that made me stop. "When I used to call you cold, what I really meant was that you never let feelings erase math." I read that sentence 3 times. Then the last line. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I finally understand why you stopped." I sat alone in the study with the screen glowing in front of me and felt something move in my chest that was not quite softness, not quite grief. Perhaps respect for the possibility of change. Perhaps only the relief of being understood too late but still in time to matter. I did not answer that night. Forgiveness is not a reflex. Not for me. Perhaps not for anyone who has spent years being turned into infrastructure. But I saved the email. That meant something. Spring came slowly that year. The garden behind the house lifted itself back into color, branch by branch. One afternoon, nearly a year after the call from Scotland, I sat in the glass room off the back of the house with a set of coastal property sketches spread out before me. Late light turned the leaves outside a saturated green. The room was quiet in a way that no longer felt like the pause before another demand. My phone buzzed with a monthly financial summary. Heartline was steady. Vale and North had posted another strong quarter. Madeline had hit her repayment benchmarks for 6 months in a row. Small amounts. Real amounts. The kind that say more about change than dramatic declarations ever do. A few minutes later, Diane appeared in the doorway holding a tray of cut fruit arranged with suspicious care. "You've been working all afternoon," she said. "You should eat something." I looked at the tray, then at her. "Thank you." She set it down and remained standing there, twisting her fingers together. "Nora, about before. About all of it. I know I was. I spared us both the performance. Let's not do remorse as theater, Diane. Let's just continue following the rules." Her eyes widened slightly. Then she nodded. "Yes, of course." When she left, I turned back to the drawings, but my gaze drifted past them to the garden. There had been a time when every phone call felt like an invasion disguised as obligation. Every request came wrapped in guilt. Every act of help quietly rewrote itself into expectation the moment it became consistent. That life had trained me to confuse competence with duty and patience with character. I know better now. When I cut off the money, I thought I was punishing one spoiled young woman in another country. What I was really doing was exposing an entire family system built on the belief that my steadiness belonged to them. It didn't. It never had. And once that truth entered the room, nothing could go back to the shape it had before. Not my marriage. Not Diane's authority. Not Madeline's illusions. Not the quiet bargain by which I had been expected to keep funding chaos in exchange for being tolerated by it. The leaves outside shifted in the wind. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Somewhere downtown, people were still buying symbols they could not afford and calling the resulting panic ambition. Somewhere else, another woman was being asked to be understanding because she was capable, asked to bend because she was strong, asked to smile because it was easier on everyone else. I hoped she would stop sooner than I had. The late sun warmed the edge of the table. I picked up my pencil and returned to the drawing in front of me, tracing a line along the edge of a glass wall that would face the sea. The plan was elegant because it respected load, balance, light, weather, stress. Buildings, like lives, survived best when their forces were acknowledged instead of denied. That was the thing my husband's family had never understood. Love is not the same as endless access. Mercy is not the same as funding denial. And peace built on one person's silent overpayment is not peace at all. It is merely delay with good manners. A text came through a moment later from Ethan. Running late. Don't wait for dinner. A year earlier, those words would have tightened something in me. Made me wonder what had gone wrong now, whose call I would be expected to take, which emotional leak I would be asked to seal before the night was over. Now I simply typed back. All right. No dread followed. That, more than anything, told me how much had changed. I stood and walked to the window. From the glass room, the garden looked almost unreal in the soft light. Beyond it, the city moved at its own relentless pace. Money changing hands, deals closing, people leaning on structures they barely noticed until they threatened to fail. Not here, I thought. Not anymore. Behind me lay the drawings, the fruit tray, the quarterly summaries, the ordinary evidence of a life that had stopped revolving around emergency. Ahead of me was more work, more carefulness, more imperfect family, more boundaries that would need maintaining because no useful line holds itself forever once drawn. That was fine. I was no longer interested in effortless love if effortless meant costly only to me. I no longer mistook being needed for being valued. And I no longer believed that the people who benefited most from my silence were entitled to call it virtue. Outside, the light thinned toward evening. Inside, the quiet remained mine. Not borrowed. Not conditional. Not waiting to be interrupted by a ringing phone from another country, and another crisis and another person who had mistaken my discipline for a service she could insult and still expect to keep. Mine. At last, and entirely mine.